Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo podcast. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna reportedly called himself the Napoleon of the West. His opponents called him a dictator. By all accounts, a complicated and controversial figure who relished leading an army and clung to power by becoming Mexico's president multiple times. Today, we reveal the real Santa Anna, the survivor's instinct that saw him change political sides and overcome exile, and what popular culture gets wrong about the general so central to the Alamo story. I'm your host, Emily Bauckham. We're joined by Professor Will Fowler from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
You were born and raised in Barcelona, Spain, and went to Britain in 1985 to study at the University of Bristol. What made you so interested in Mexican history, particularly Santa Anna, to the point where you are now one of the world's foremost experts on him?
It's true. I was brought up in Spain, English dad, Spanish mum, went to university in England with a view to studying drama and becoming an actor. And in studying Spanish as well as drama, was inspired by Professor Michael Costello, who was one of the key professors in Bristol and who was one of the main authorities on Mexican history. And it was in the way that we all become at some point, I would like to think, or can become kind of inspired by our educators. Costello was the person who kind of suddenly lighted up in me this kind of fascination with Mexican history.
Describe your research into Santa Anna and the time you've spent in Mexico, really immersing yourself in his world.
I started with Michael Costello doing a PhD on José María Tornel without really knowing much about Santa Anna or this period, and researching Tornel for my PhD. Tornel was Santa Anna's number two, basically. It was kind of his ideologue, his conspirator, his kind of, key kind of friend and loyal propagandist throughout his career. And by studying Tornel, that led me into kind of wanting to know more about the period, know more about Santa Anna, especially because in studying Tornel, what became apparent to me was that here we had a brilliant kind of writer and ideologue who had kind of associated himself with this character that seemed to be quite sinister and problematic. And I couldn't really make sense of that. Why was it that somebody like Tornel kind of spent all of his life kind of supporting Santa Anna? And that maybe then kind of reconsider perhaps we need to rethink the figure of Santa Anna. And so that led to kind of years and years of research, going back and forth to Mexico. From 1990 to 91, I lived in Mexico City, and then spent time researching Santa Anna in his own home province of Veracruz, working in the regional archives there. And it's been, 3 decades, basically, of going back and forth and researching Mexico.
Well, let's dive in. Tell us about Santa Anna's early life in Veracruz, Mexico. What kind of family was he born into in February of 1794?
Santa Anna was born into a lower middle class family. His father was a minor colonial bureaucrat working for the Spanish crown. Was born in Jalapa, the mountain town of Jalapa in the province of Veracruz. But at some point, he ended up basically living in the port of Veracruz. He was one of 7, and it would have been a background of a criollo background. I think what one has to kind of emphasize here is the fact that this was a family that was born in Mexico, that any Spanish ancestors as such went back a couple of generations, which meant that although they were white, kind of ethnically and associated with the colonial regime, in being criollos, in having been born in New Spain, but kind of not being Spanish, they did not have access to power as such. So you're always going to have a situation where, although he grew up in a context that was very much part of this colonial establishment, he did belong to a criollo family that was discriminated against in that context. His uncle in particular was a lawyer that had tried to prosper, and it got to a stage where he could not kind of go further up in the hierarchy because of that colonial setup where, according to the rules of the Spanish monarchy, basically you had to be Spanish to kind of be in any position of power and influence. So that in a way would have been there, although there was no reason to, during his childhood, to kind of turn against the Spanish monarchy. But I'm just kind of establishing this because it is part of that fabric as such, which in a way may explain that subsequently he would eventually endorse and fight for independence.
And what made Santa Anna, at just 16 years old, want to join the military?
It's a very good question. In his memoirs, he talks about that he just felt this need to kind of, the call of the arms was there. It's difficult to know. Maybe he was just We know from an account by one of his contemporaries that he was quite a restless kid. So one assumes that maybe he just kind of wanted some action, basically, and wanted to get away from this kind of stifling kind of context. But it's difficult to know exactly what it was that led him to do that, although the army would become one of his passions for all of his life, really.
And you threaded the needle a minute ago, but being from a coastal town like Veracruz, outside of the seat of power, it did impact his military career.
Absolutely. And I think that being born in Jalapa, growing up in Port of Veracruz, it will be critical and very important for him in subsequent years. One, because Veracruz was the most important port of Mexico. And the geopolitical importance of Veracruz will become all the more important with independence. So that if you were the strongman of that region, you had far more power in terms of negotiating with the national government. Because if you control Veracruz and you control the custom houses of Veracruz, in a way you were in a position of much more power and influence that had Santa Anna been kind of born and bred in Oaxaca, for example. But also being born there meant that he was, and grown up there, he was immune to yellow fever, which at that time nobody knew exactly where yellow fever came from, but it was obvious that if you lived in the region of Veracruz and you were not from Veracruz, you were very likely to get it. And in a number of conflicts, Santa Anna would use that to his advantage he didn't care if a siege of the port lasted as long as it had to last, because he could just kind of quite happily hang in there, whilst any army coming from another part of Mexico or from abroad would clearly suffer the consequences of disease.
He fights in the Mexican War of Independence, which began in 1810. This is a long war that sees Santa Anna switch sides.
His role in the War of Independence is a fascinating one in the sense that it is quite peripheral if we are to compare the role of Santa Anna with many of the other insurgents or royalists that then changed sides subsequently that were involved in the key crucial campaigns of the Bajío in the center of Mexico. Santa Anna becomes a cadet in 1810 before the War of Independence kicks off. His role in the War of Independence is peripheral in that he will end up going to Texas, actually, as part of Arredondo's mission, kind of as a cadet. The first kind of military actions he's involved in have nothing to do, in a way, with the actual War of Independence per se. So it's only kind of as of 1815 that in the port of Veracruz, he kind of has a remit as a royalist officer chasing insurgents in the area. But he doesn't get involved in any of the major campaigns of the first 6 years of the War of Independence.
1813 does bring him close to San Antonio with the Battle of Medina.
It is a very important kind of event in the case for Santana's career, because I think that what we have is that Santana is somebody that will eventually feel or have an emotional attachment to Texas. I mean, his crucial kind of years of growing up and becoming a young man and an army officer, and the excitement, all of that is associated with Texas and his actions in Texas, and Medina being one obvious instance of that. So that when you will have later on the War of Independence or the Texan Revolution of Independence, and subsequently the independence of Texas, whilst there will be a number of members of the Mexican political class, like Lucas Alamán or José Joaquín de Herrera, who in the early 1840s kind of actually are prepared to recognize the independence of Texas. Somebody like Santa Anna finds that impossible, because for him, Texas is part of Mexico, because he has been there, he fought there. So it is kind of part of his identity as such.
The Battle of Medina plants that seed. And he initially fought for the crown, as you said, but then he switches sides and joins the fight for independence. What happened?
I mean, one has to think about how the War of Independence itself changed over those 11 years. And so by the time that we have Agustín de Iturbide becoming the liberator as such, leading this second kind of attempt for independence, it will be a very different kind of agenda, and it will attract a different type of revolutionary. And in fact, by then, with events in Spain as well, I mean, this is all kind of very complex, but what you have is many criollos who maybe were not ready for independence in 1810 or 1812 or 1816. By 1821, they're ready for independence. And Iturbide seems to promise a different type of independence, one that is advocating unity, which means Spaniards can stay, independence, obviously, and also placing the Catholic faith, religion, as one of the key, those three guarantees. And in that context, Santa Anna, like pretty much every single military officer, criollo military officer, will kind of switch sides at this point and kind of embrace the cause of independence. And once Santa Anna does this, he certainly kind of goes for it and will be mainly responsible for the liberation of Veracruz, the province of Veracruz.
He gets rewarded with command of the port of Veracruz, but this friendly atmosphere doesn't last long. What happens?
Iturbide very, very early on is aware of the threat that Santa Anna might pose to him as this kind of very charismatic, successful army officer in the province of Veracruz. When he liberates Veracruz, the port of Veracruz, the commander, the Spanish commander in charge of the port of Veracruz, who feels betrayed by Santa Anna, refuses to give the port to Santa Anna. He's prepared to give it over to the independence fighting forces as long as somebody else kind of is responsible for that. And Iturbide will back Rincon, who is one of Santa Anna's enemies from his childhood days in Jalapa, as the person who is given the title of liberator of the port of Veracruz, even if Santa Anna is the one who carries that out. And I think Santa Anna from that very early on, is resentful towards Iturbide for that. Iturbide also showers all of those commanders that join his Plan of Iguala with promotions, but he takes up a bit too long to promote Santa Anna. So there's an ongoing kind of dispute there. And Iturbide, after a year of being kind of emperor of Mexico, is aware that Santa Anna is becoming more and more popular in Veracruz. And so he goes to Jalapa to meet with Santa Anna and basically invites him to come to Mexico City and leave his kind of bailiwick behind in Veracruz. And Santa Anna knows that this is a way of taking power away from him. And this will, in a way, trigger his revolt of the 2nd of December, 1822, the first Republican revolt as such against Iturbide Sempa.
Santa Anna is not successful in that revolt, but he's a survivor. He outlasts the emperor's power. And as we've discussed in a previous episode, the Mexican Constitution of 1824 establishes a president of Mexico. So where does Santa Anna stand politically during this time?
So Santa Anna, once he kind of embraces this Republican cause in that revolt of the 2nd of December, 1822, he will remain, in a way, a Republican and a Federalist. And in fact, following that revolt, which although he himself isn't successful as such, it will become a successful revolt in that it brings down Iturbide eventually after the plan of Casamata. Santa Anna will find him then in San Luis Potosí on the 5th of June, 1823, carrying out another revolt, this time calling for a federal constitution. We have him as a Federalist, as a Republican, and in fact, he's very much a liberal, a constitutional liberal, with kind of that aligns himself with more of the kind of progressive, generous politics of his contemporaries of the time.
We do see a few years of relative peace at this point in Santa Anna's life. He gets married for the first time during this period. What do we know about his wife at this time?
His wife is very young, has a Spanish Galician father, has money. The marriage allows Santa Anna to buy Manga de Clavo. That will become kind of one of his favorite haciendas, where he will kind of retreat to more often than not. In fact, spending more time in Manga de Clavo than in the National Palace of Mexico City. And she will have several children with him. And in fact, what we know of her, she proved fairly kind of important or crucial in the running of the haciendas. She was very supportive of him. What we have is Santa Anna does spend some time in Yucatan. He becomes governor of Yucatan briefly and has this wonderful idea of liberating Cuba, which doesn't happen.
The relative peace doesn't last very long. Spain tries one more time to take back Mexico. Spain fails, and Santa Anna becomes a national hero for it.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key episodes of Santa Anna's life and what will give him this kind of extremely overwhelming prestige at the time is the role he plays in combating this Spanish attempt at reconquest that takes place in 1829. So you have this expedition led by Brigadier Barradas that arrives in Tampico to the north of Veracruz, and it is Santa Anna who kind of leads the troops that defeat the Spaniards on the 11th of September, 1829. And it is this victory which will prove incredibly important in consolidating his fame as the hero of Tampico. And in a way, it is this particular event that, and the way it is celebrated, the way that it is commemorated, the kind of the importance it has, the resonance it has at the time, will explain how subsequent defeats, in a way, become overshadowed simply by the long-lasting kind of memory of the success of his crushing of the Spaniards in 1829.
It's around this time he reportedly calls himself the Napoleon of the West. Did he really call himself that?
So he didn't call himself the Napoleon of the West. That has been subsequently attributed from a US perspective, because obviously from a Mexican perspective, nobody thought in terms of the West. That is a kind of subsequent view imposed by a later US historiography. But having said that, we do have reports from the British press in 1829 talking about that he is being called the Napoleon of Mexico, and it is something that he likes. Now, Santa Anna, like all those caudillos that emerged across Spanish America in this early national period, they all look to Napoleon as kind of this role model. The ability you have to have this kind of revolutionary warlord that becomes a kind of a superhero, a Superman of his day. And I think that Santa Anna, like so many of his contemporaries, did clearly look admiringly at Napoleon and like to be equated with him, even though we do not have any evidence of him having actually said, I am like Napoleon.
But it's
It's not
clear
like
Napoleon is a hero in some ways.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not the extreme of Rafael Carrera of Guatemala, who used to have a mirror next to a portrait of Napoleon, and Carrera would look at himself and then look at Napoleon next to his image in the reflection in the mirror. It's not like that. We are told, there's one source does talk about the fact that he liked to lead from the front in terms of when he went with his troops, and there was a picture that he had seen of Napoleon leading the troops, and that was kind of what had inspired him.
Santa Anna is so popular, he's elected president of Mexico on April 1st, 1833. But he's not really interested in governing or being in the room where it happens.
So Santa Anna will be popular for most of, at least kind of up until 1855. We can see that there is a cult and a following. And clearly there will be moments where he is not so popular, but he retains that degree of popularity to the extent that more often than not, he is either elected as president or people go and look for him and call upon him becoming president. Now, he is elected in 1833, clearly on the back of the fame that he has acquired because of his actions in the Battle of Tampico, but he's not interested in power per se. And this is another key point. I think that there is a tendency sometimes to, or certain historiography, to view him as this power-hungry kind of individual, but actually he does not like being in the National Palace in Mexico City or the boring aspects of governance. Yes, he likes to be known as a president, he likes the title, he likes the fame, but really what he prefers is to go back to his haciendas in Veracruz, Manga de Clavo originally, but he will, as time goes by, acquire more land and actually spends a lot of time in his haciendas paying close attention to how they're run. And that's something that, in terms of my research, having kind of looked at the regional archives and all the different legal regional archives, he was very concrete in terms of when he rented parts of his land, what people could grow, what they couldn't grow, what animals they could have, with very close instructions. So he's actually a hands-on hacendado. He's not the kind of person that has haciendas as a status symbol and doesn't really kind of care about it. So in a way, he's more of an hacendado and certainly kind of a military man than a politician, which means that in 1833, yes, he's elected president, but very quickly he delegates and allows the vice president, Valentin Gómez Farías, to run the show. That kind of dynamic, we're going to find out throughout his career. He's very much an absent president. He will come back when the political class in Mexico City reaches a kind of dead end and they can't resolve their differences, and he comes back as this kind of, again, Napoleonic figure that is somehow above politics and can kind of resolve people's issues. At least that's how he likes to see himself.
Spirited debates across greater Mexico are starting to turn into skirmishes about whether government should be centralist or federalist. And this is another case where we see Santa Anna switch sides at a pivotal time. What's changing his mind?
Santa Anna, like many Mexicans, in fact, at the time, what they undergo is there is a realization that the 1824 Constitution is not working. And I think what you have is from the elections of 1828, where the results are contested and where there is a sense that the country economically is struggling. The dreams that Mexicans have had of how Mexico could become this wonderful kind of new power in achieving independence. And a lot of blame is placed precisely on the 1824 Constitution and on the federalist structure, in a sense that different states by 1829 are not contributing the money that they're meant to the national treasury. And what is happening in Texas is just one example of something that is beginning to concern a Mexican political class that believes that federalism, in a way, is kind of leading to secessionism. It is kind of allowing different states to do their own thing and not contribute to a national good. This shift towards centralism, in fact, does attract not just kind of Santa Anna, but a whole group of politicians that were federalists before, and they will become centralists subsequently. Having said that, Santa Anna accepts this shift. He is not actually instrumental in kind of bringing it about. He's not there when the 1836 Constitution kind of replaces the 1835 Constitution, because he obviously goes to Texas to fight against the Texans.
The term dictator often gets used in association with Santa Anna when we're talking about the Texas Revolution. At this point, is that term accurate?
It's not entirely accurate in the sense that I think that the accusation of being a dictator comes about because of the sacking of Gómez Farías and the closure of that Congress and the end of the 1824 Constitution. But Santa Anna, if there was an opportunity there to become a dictator, he doesn't take it. What he does is summon a subsequent Constituent Congress, which will therefore draft another liberal constitution, which is the 1836 constitution. So in terms of him being a dictator as such, that is not true. He will again have a chance of becoming a dictator in 1841, when in that instance he brings down the government of Anastasio Bustamante and ends the 1836 constitution. There are brief spells of perhaps dictatorial involvement, but not with any view of becoming a permanent dictator. Santa Anna will eventually, yes, become a dictator, kind of like a proper one, and a very bloody one as such, and repressive one in 1853 to 1855. And then we can genuinely talk about him as a dictator. But it's premature to think of him in those terms. And I think that view of him as a dictator in 1835 kind of has suited a certain narrative of the Texan Revolution in a way to justify kind of what happened in Texas, as if it was a response or a kind of a cry for freedom against kind of Santa Anna's dictatorship, which wasn't really the case.
Several Mexican states start openly rebelling, including the one most central to our story here at the Alamo. The Texas Revolution unfolds from October 1835 until April 1836. Now, as Santa Anna leads his forces, has being president changed him compared to the earlier military battles of his career, or is he still just focused on being in the theater of battle?
I think he's very much, as you say, really wants to be in the theater of battle. I mean, I think that there was no reason why a president, and being president of the Mexican Republic, that he had to be fighting the actual battles in Texas. I mean, he could have easily sent somebody else. He's the president. But Santa Anna far prefers to be kind of in the middle of it all, in the battle, rather than in some kind of ventilated room in the National Palace, letting others get involved in the action. So that, in a way, accounts for his going out there and being the one who raises the army in San Luis Potosí and makes it up to be involved in the campaign in Texas. And as we've discussed earlier, there is also the fact that he does have this kind of emotional attachment to Texas, so that there's this aspect that he wants to be involved.
What strikes you most about his actions during the siege and battle of the Alamo?
I mean, I think with the siege and battle of the Alamo, a crucial point I think we can make is that Santa Anna was never a great strategist. I think that he was certainly kind of a valiant soldier, but his approach to combat is one where he doesn't seem to really think long and hard about how many people may die in battle, and quite happily and also has this penchant for attacking at night, which is what happens in the Alamo, and it happens in a number of his battles. So his attack on the Alamo, when it happens, is very costly in terms of human lives, and lots of Mexican troops die.
But later in life, Santa Anna writes that William Barrett Travis was to blame for the violence at the Alamo. What do you make of that claim?
The claim is coming from the view that had Travis surrendered when they offered him the chance to surrender, then that wouldn't have happened. But if you look at what happened in Goliad, where people did surrender and they were all executed, the national government had passed a decree, the Tornel decree, that basically said these people are pirates, so they are to be executed. We do not accept surrender because we're not fighting a foreign army where there is war between nations, where there are deals and agreements. And he says in his own terms, this is not one of our tragedies, one of our domestic conflicts where we normally kind of understand each other. These are these foreigners that are come to take our land away. In that sense, I think Santa Anna is ruthless and brutal, and so I don't think we can not blame him for what happened.
Ultimately, Santa Anna and his troops are surprised and defeated by the Texans at the Battle of San Jacinto. Now, much has been made about the way Santa Anna was discovered by Texan troops. Walk us through that.
It feels as if it's out of a novel, really. I mean, you have, one, the fact that his troops going to sleep, and he goes to sleep in a context where, I mean, he spent the whole night before keeping an eye on his troops and that everybody's ready for an imminent engagement with Houston's troops. More troops arrive at midday. He gives the instructions that somebody wakes him up. He's just going to take basically a power nap, if we can put it somehow, and that he's to be woken up the moment that they're finished eating, the troops that have just joined them. In seeing him go to sleep, other troops go to sleep, and you have this extraordinary moment where most of them are asleep. So Houston seizes that opportunity, and you have, therefore, the Battle of San Jacinto takes place. You have then Santa Anna is awoken. He runs away. He finds a farmhouse, changes clothes, but keeps his special kind of shirt and a special kind of emblems on him underneath the clothes. When he is made captive, they don't know they've caught Santa Anna, but they bring him back to where the other prisoners are, and it's the moment that he arrives there. All the troops, in seeing him, stand to attention, and of course it becomes evident that it's Santa Anna. I mean, it's almost out of a Garcia Marquez novel, isn't it, really?
And a deal is struck between Texas and Mexico with the Treaty of Velasco. What is agreed upon, and does it really hold any water here?
So the Treaty of Velasco, what is fascinating is how Santa Anna kind of negotiates under duress in this context. So that, in fact, he is not prepared to sign a document where he recognizes the independence of Texas. And I think it's important to note this because time and again we see, in films and what have you, that he recognized the independence of Texas. He didn't. What he was prepared to agree, he certainly kind of gave orders in one of the treaties of Velasco for his troops to retreat, and certainly he did that. But he didn't agree to that Texas was independent, but he agreed that a commission should be able to go to the National Congress in Mexico and present the case for independence, which is not the same thing as recognizing the independence of Texas. There's a secret treaty together with the public one. It's also agreed that in exchange for this, he will be let go. And so they take him to the port, and then he is not allowed to go to Mexico, as was agreed in that secret treaty. So then he subsequently says, well, the treaty is worthless because the Texans haven't done what they said they would, which was also part of the deal. So in a way, the treaty, of course, is not recognized by the national government in Mexico, which will explain why Mexico will, during the subsequent years, there will be several attempts, half-hearted as such, of reconquering Texas. And what you find is that even in 1840, there is a moment where the British minister plenipotentiary in Mexico City actually proposes to the Santa Anna's administration that they recognize the independence of Texas. And in exchange, Britain will be prepared to provide troops to protect other parts of Mexico. And even in that context, Santa Anna's government is not prepared to recognize the independence of Texas because for them, this treaty has no value. And Texas is still part of Mexico. And outrageous as what I'm going to say now may seem, you could compare Santa Anna to Lincoln on the basis that if in 1861 Abraham Lincoln is concerned with the Union, Santa Anna is concerned in 1835-36 with the Union, with the Mexican Union, and holding it together.
That's a very interesting comparison. One thing Santa Anna does value is his life. On display right now in the Alamo exhibit at the Ralston Family Collection Center is a gold snuff box that Santa Anna gave to Sam Houston for sparing his life.
He clearly values what Houston does for him at that point. And interestingly, you also have the involvement of Lorenzo de Zavala, who was a political enemy of Santa Anna's. And yet, there is a kind of rapport and an understanding in this context. And I think that certainly he valued his life and was grateful in that sense. And he was generous for example, Waddy Thompson was the U.S. minister plenipotentiary in the early 1840s in Mexico. And he tells the anecdote that seeing a cockfight, because Santa Anna used to love his cockerels and his cockfights, kind of praised one of Santa Anna's cockerels. Waddy Thompson goes on to say that he returned to New York eventually and found that the cockerel that he had mentioned, Santa Anna had actually sent this cockerel all the way to New York so that it was there waiting for him. So you have that aside of him, which I guess the present to Houston is but one of those kind of characteristics of his.
That's very interesting that he valued the chickens in these cockfights because he compared his soldiers' lives to chickens during the Texas Revolution.
Yes, I think there's one historian who talks about, I think that he has a kind of games approach to warfare, that he gambles in the same way that he used to gamble with cockerels and these cockfights. So maybe it's a suggestive idea.
And during the negotiations for the Treaty of Velasco, Santa Anna makes some interesting comments about liberty and whether his people are fit for liberty. What's his message here, and how does it speak to any evolution throughout his lifetime?
There is certainly an evolution in terms of the Santanistas, not just him, but I'm talking about people like Tornel and his supporters, from having almost come to endorse and support the idea of universal male suffrage in the 1820s to changing to the extent that after the war against the US between 1846 and 48, and seeing how Mexico has failed in its various constitutional efforts, coming to believe that actually the Mexican people aren't ready for representative government. And so that by 1849, in the Santanista newspaper, La Palanca, there is an article which talks about the fact that the Mexican nation is sick and needs to take medicine to cure itself. It's kind of, we have this metaphor. And then he goes on to say it doesn't just need a doctor, it needs a guardian to make sure that it takes its medicine. And this will be the kind of argument used to support the dictatorship dictatorship of 1853, where really they come to the view that Mexican people aren't ready for, and that they have to kind of, in a way, impose themselves. And it's a view that we flash forward to the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. General Porfirio Diaz, in the famous interview that he gave, to the Creelman interview of 1908, is only then saying that he believes that perhaps now the Mexican people are ready for democracy as such. Having said that, I think it's worth also noting that in the context of the Texan Revolution, Santa Anna does also make a point of saying that there are enslaved people in Texas, and that he represents and stands for a kind of liberty that is not found in Texas.
Our conversation continues after this message.
This is Charlie Crockett, Texas musician and descendant of Davy Crockett, inviting you to visit the Alamo. It's not the same Alamo you, remember. There's lots of new things to experience, like the 500 artifacts inside the Alamo exhibit at the Ralston Family Collection Center, the new Mission Gate and Lunette outdoor exhibit, and Surrounded, the Alamo Augmented Experience. It's all part of an ongoing restoration and expansion that will write the Alamo's next chapter. So don't wait. Plan your visit today at thealamo.org.
Welcome back to the Alamo podcast. After the Texas Revolution, Santa Anna is forced into exile for a few years, but this is not the last time we'll hear from him. He eventually returns to his hometown of Veracruz and stages a political comeback.
So his comeback, which again is the best way he can do it in a way, is through valor and in combat. So he returns in 1837, and at that point you would think his career is absolutely over. He kind of retreats to Manga de Clavo in his hacienda and kind of keeps a low profile. He does publish a manifesto explaining what happened in Texas. It's not my fault kind of thing. And then you have this French intervention in Mexico, one of the first French intervention, where you have kind of this absurd known as the French Pastry War. The demand from the French government, which is completely preposterous, that Mexico pays 600,000 pesos on the basis that some pâtissier had his shop ransacked during a riot in the 1820s. And what you have is kind of the French arrive, they send their fleet, and you have this kind of arrival and an attempt to take Veracruz on the 5th of December, 1838. Santa Anna comes out of his retirement and leads the defense of Veracruz. It is in forcing the French to retreat back to their ships that a cannonball hits his horse, and kind of in a way he has to have his left leg amputated. And the speech he writes, which is a memorable speech, kind of thinking he's going to die and that he's on his deathbed, talks about, that what he wants is that people remember him as a good Mexican. It has, again, a massive impact. It's similar to the way that the events of the 11th of September 1829 kind of had that incredible resonance. So this, yet again, will be remembered as this key moment, so that many Mexicans will be prepared to forgive and forget, what happened in Texas and San Jacinto as such, and his captivity. And what they will remember is the glorious victory of the 11th of September, 1829, and now the extraordinary kind of beating of the French in Veracruz on the 5th of December, 1838, even though actually eventually they have to settle for paying the 600,000 pesos.
But it all works. He becomes president again.
He becomes president again. The next time he becomes president, he's invited just to stand in whilst Anastasio Bustamante goes and combats some kind of federalist rebels. But he will be kind of, in a way, make it big as such in 1841. And then from 1841 to 1844, although yet again, he tends to return to Veracruz, where he's either in Manga de Clavo or now buys more haciendas and buys El Encero as well. But what you have is that government, the 1841 to 44 government, is perhaps the one that I have argued is the most representative of a Santanista view, simply because it has a number of key Veracruzanos in positions of power within that are ministers for the duration of these years. So there is a degree of continuity. People like Tornel as Minister of War, you have Bocanegra as Minister of Justice, and Trigueros as Minister of Finance. So there is a certain kind of project as such, although Santa Anna typically is hardly there.
Around this time, his wife passes away. He is 50 years old and he marries a 16-year-old. Was that considered out of the norm then, like it would be now?
It was normal, I'm afraid. It wasn't completely kind of unusual for this to happen. But there is an element of shock at how speedily this happens. I think that the mourning for Inés doesn't last as long as I think the establishment expected it to. So there is a degree of scandal around this marriage. I mean, again, it is a marriage of convenience. It's a marriage that has a financial dimension attached. Dolores Tosta, this second wife, actually kind of looking closely, seems to do all right out of this. She doesn't really have to spend much time with him and will not, in subsequent years, won't accompany him on a number of exiles, but live her own life in comfort as such, although she will be prepared at the very end of his life to kind of look after him.
What causes Santa Anna to step down as president in 1844?
His government had entered a stage of crisis. I think that Santa Anna also had become less receptive to criticism. He had his ministers, this group of Santanistas that had been running the different ministries, were asking him to come back to Mexico. I mean, the 1843 Constitution kind of was one that finally kind of gave the executive a certain amount of power, and so they wanted the executive, the Santanistas, wanted Santa Anna to be their president. And yet Santa Anna took against these criticisms, and what you have is he sacks Tornel, Bocanegra steps down, Trigueros steps down, and he's kind of suddenly left on a way on his own. And a general sense of dissatisfaction for a whole series of reasons will result in what is known as the Revolution of the 3 Hours, whereby a coup takes place in Mexico City, end of 1844. And during this revolution, not only do they kind of end Santa Anna's kind of government, but they go to the cemetery of Santa Paula, where the remains of Santa Anna's leg that initially had been buried in the Hacienda in Veracruz, but as of 1842 had been exhumed, and then they had been placed almost like the relics of a saint in the cemetery of Santa Paula. A crowd goes into the cemetery the 6th of December 1844 and take the remains of the leg and play football with it, and the remains of the leg disappear, something that Santa Anna will be very, very upset about. Santa Anna will try and kind of fight back, but he realizes that there's no point and will go into exile in 1845.
Okay, we've mentioned his legs twice, and this is one of the more peculiar aspects of Santa Anna's story. You mentioned a moment ago it got amputated, this public demonstration involving one of his legs. They play a game with it. This was something that has become kind of part of his lore over time.
Absolutely. What is interesting about it, I guess, I mean, beyond the element of the operatic or the absurd that we might see in this, well, I mean, more significantly and more importantly, it kind of speaks a lot about the cult of Santa Anna and how popular he was, at least kind of in terms of this adoration of his leg.
That wooden leg is now on display in the Illinois State Military Museum in Springfield, Illinois.
I mean, fascinating how much he struggled with the one leg subsequently, and that didn't stop him from going into combat in Buena Vista and what have you. And actually, the operation wasn't a particularly good operation, so that the wounds that he had would reopen time and again. But I think this cult of the leg and the fascination with the leg, in a way, it makes me think in a way of Max Weber and his theory of charismatic domination, and how in moments of crisis, Weber argued in the 1920s, when there's a crisis in terms of economic, political, social, religious, people lose faith in the institutions, and they put all of their faith in a messianic individual that will come and somehow, like Jesus, come and solve everything. And of course, Weber argues it doesn't work. Charismatic domination never works. It may work briefly in terms of, but clearly no one single individual is capable of solving everybody's problems, right? You need institutions. And so the leg, in a way, is part of this fascination and charismatic domination element of Santa Anna's career. But at this point, certainly in 1844, people turned against him, and that was the end of the remains of his leg.
Most people don't get a second act in politics, but Santa Anna, after being exiled twice, he's not interested in going to sit on a beach somewhere. He actually gets a third act in politics during the Mexican-American War. By this time, in 1846, Texas has now joined the United States.
The way he gets back to Mexico in the context of the war against the United States, so if we have him leaving, where we had him leaving in 1845, he goes to Cuba and goes into exile. The government that is formed as a result of the Revolution of 3 Hours with José Joaquín de Herrera fails to kind of, in a way, give any stability to Mexico, and there will be a coup carried out by a very reactionary general, Mariano Paredes y Arriaga, in December 1845, which will lead to his dictatorship of early 1846. So the war between the US and Mexico kicks off in April 1846, when Paredes y Arriaga is this dictator in charge of Mexico. Now, Polk, who had become president of the US in a way on a bill and a campaign for expansion, believes that if he can negotiate with Santa Anna while Santa Anna is in exile, kind of whilst mobilizing troops and defeating with tailored winning initial victories in the north of Mexico, the Mexican political class may be prepared to negotiate a settlement whereby they grant the U.S. the kind of territories, land that Polk is after. Spies as such, or representatives of Polk, go and visit Santa Anna in Cuba, and deals are struck whereby the incredible sum of about $2 million are negotiated in Congress to be given to Santa Anna, and that he is allowed through the blockade, the U.S. blockade of Mexico. So he's allowed back into Mexico with the hope that he will use this money in a way to buy off the supposed corrupt Mexican political class, and therefore settle with Polk in a way that there is no need for a war of invasion or kind of a long-lasting conflict, but that in fact, you have the final recognition of Texas, which has become part of the U.S. in 1845, and that you have kind of the possibility of getting what will eventually, after 2 years or almost 2 years of war, become part of the U.S. as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of the 2nd of February 1848. We're talking about, New Mexico and Arizona and California and parts of Utah and Wyoming, Colorado, and so forth. Now, Santa Anna takes the money, returns to Mexico at a time when also people are turning against this dictator, Paredes y Arriaga. They still remember, incredibly, Santa Anna's glorious days in terms of the war. And it is the radical liberals that, in a way, Valentin Gómez Farías people, that if you remember, Gómez Farías had been his vice president back in 1833-34, that, in a way, join in bringing him back and supporting him back. Now, what Santa Anna does, he gets back and he doesn't use this money to kind of corrupt the political class so that it settles for peace, but in fact uses some of it to fund kind of the war effort. And he is corrupt himself and does pocket quite a lot of it himself. But what we find is that he then leads the different campaigns against the invading army, whether it is against Taylor in the north, Battle of Buena Vista, or then subsequently against Winfield Scott in Cerro Gordo and in the campaign of the Valley of Mexico. So that's how he comes back, and he is elected president then during the war. But again, he does not actually spend any time as president. He lets Gómez Farías run the show in Mexico City, whilst he kind of, again, organizes his army in the San Luis Potosí and heads up to the north to face Taylor in the Battle of Buena Vista. Gómez Farías, there will be a revolt in Mexico City, the revolt of the Polcos, which will bring down Gómez Farías, and Santa Anna will find himself allowing different interim presidents, acting presidents, whilst he continues the war effort. So yes, he is elected president, but he doesn't actually kind of preside in Mexico, but in fact continues to lead the war effort.
Which is a pattern in his life, as we've seen. And Mexico is ultimately defeated. Santa Anna goes back into exile, this time in Jamaica and what's now Colombia. Then he gets a fourth act in public life, becoming president of Mexico one last time.
So he goes into exile and tries to keep the war going. Let's kind of establish that. I mean, following the fall of Mexico City, his plan is, like the Russian generals against Napoleon in 1812, to continue, let them take the capital, but he is going to get troops in Oaxaca and come back. But Benito Juárez in Oaxaca doesn't let him do that, so he does end up going into exile, and he completely disgusted with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But yes, they call him back. He's invited back in 1853 after a series of post-war moderate liberal governments that don't seem able to kind of address or solve the many problems that continue to plague Mexico. And as I explained a moment ago, we also have a context by now where there is a group of people, Santanistas, linking up with the conservatives that believe that now all that Mexican can do to kind of, in a way, solve the situation is to have a dictatorship. But even radical liberals like Miguel Lerdo de Tejada write to Santa Anna in the hope that he will come back and represent them in government. So again, he retains this popularity, and he comes back with a view of now becoming a dictator. And this is when he is given the title of His Serene Highness. So this is the kind of the 1853-55 government is his. I mean, when we talk about Santa Anna as a dictator, this is when he really is a dictator.
Not during the Texas Revolution, but some 20 years later.
Absolutely.
The administration faces money problems.
It faces huge money problems. And not only that, in following the United States government, following the discovery of gold in California in 1848, have a need to kind of, in a way, acquire more land, the Valley of La Mesilla, in order to, in a way, build a railway and shorten the journey of the gold to the East Coast. And so they press for the acquisition of La Mesilla. Santa Anna does everything he can not to sell La Mesilla during a number of months, tries to kind of stall this, but in the end, fearing another war and because of all the dire straits of the Mexican government, finds itself settling for what's known as the Gadsden Purchase. La Mesilla Sol is between Arizona and New Mexico, near Tucson. And what you have from a Mexican perspective, there's always talk that this legend that Santa Anna sold half of Mexico to the United States. In a way, that comes from kind of a mixing of the sale of the Gadsden Purchase and what happened in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which, of course, he wasn't responsible for.
He is nonetheless removed from office and forced into exile yet again in 1855, and he does spend most of the last 2 decades of his life in exile. What are those later years like?
I think when he left in 1855, as he had managed to come back so many times, I think he still believed he would come back. And he will make 2 attempts at coming back again before finally eventually being allowed back as an old man. So he will attempt to come back in 1864. And this is during the French intervention of Mexico, when Mexican conservatives, together with Napoleon III, had come together to bring about the imposition of Archduke Maximilian, a Habsburg prince, on the Mexican throne. And in that context, Santa Anna kind of forgets, or conveniently forgets, his Republican credentials and offers his services and returns in a way, I think, with a view of manipulating the situation to kind of make his own comeback. But the French authorities know that that's probably what is on his mind and make him sign a document on arrival in Veracruz that should he make any public statement, he will be kicked out of the country.
Wow.
And he can't help himself. He publishes a manifesto, kind of, I'm back, guys, look at me. And he's kicked out after 12 days. As a result of that, he is reminded of his Republican credentials, will then continue to start publishing all kinds of manifestos saying that I was the founder of the Republic back in 1822 against Iturbide, and funds his own attempt to return in 1867, just as the French troops have left, and it's just the last imperialistas with Maximilian kind of in their last stand. And he arrives in Veracruz and is about to actually liberate Veracruz, and would have posed a bit of a problem for Juarez and company because he's prepared to link up with another of the liberal commanders, but not with Juarez. And the U.S. Navy intervenes on bequest of Benito Juarez, stops him from disembarking in Veracruz, and forces him to go to Yucatan. And it is in disembarking in Yucatan that the liberal Republican forces arrest him. And Juarez demands that he is put on trial with the same charges that applying the law of the 25th of January, 1862, which is the law that resulted in the execution of Maximilian on the 19th of June, 1867. So that in a way, Juarez was hoping that Santa Anna would be accused of having been kind of linked to the French intervention, and therefore accused of being a traitor, and therefore deserving the death penalty. And whilst Maximilian is executed, as are 2 conservative generals, Santa Anna, in being put on trial in the theater in the port of Veracruz, because he is a Veracruzano, because I think the Veracruzanos still remember him as a hero, despite everything, in a way. He's kind of found half guilty, but not entirely guilty, so he is not sentenced to death, he is just sentenced to exile. Juarez is so angry at this that the 6 generals that were responsible for this kind of trial, he puts them in prison for 6 months to kind of teach them a lesson. So Santa Anna thereafter goes back into exile. He will be in different kind of Caribbean islands thereafter, and is only allowed back with, interestingly, a Veracruzano president, Lerdo de Tejada, who allows him back in 1874, and will spend the last 2 years of his life in Mexico City, living in significant poverty, relative poverty, I guess, but compared to what he once had, living with his wife, his young wife, not so young, but still obviously much younger than him, who will supposedly pay beggars and people to come in and say to Santa Anna, you are our hero, we still need you, to make the old man feel still well and happy. And he dies in 1876.
At age 82, buried with full military honors. How is the period known as the Age of Santa Anna remembered now in Mexico?
Because it is during this period that Mexico lost half of its national territory to the United States, there has been a tendency to, in the national curriculum, I mean, this is changing, but there has been a tendency for many, many years of, in a way, skipping this period. So you basically go from the beginning of the War of Independence, and then you go to the Niños Héroes. So what is remembered of the war against the United States are these 6 cadets that allegedly preferred to commit suicide rather than hand over the Mexican flag to the Americans. And then it kind of skips to Benito Juarez as kind of the great hero, the Abraham Lincoln of Mexican history, to put it somehow. The period, the early national period, when it is referred to as the Age of Santa Anna or the Age of Chaos, in a way, it's to blame Santa Anna. Santa Anna is almost blamed for everything that went wrong following the achievement of independence. So there is this sense of Santa Anna as this baddie of baddies, as one of Mexico's worst traitors and the man responsible for everything that went wrong. This is a view that certainly in terms of academia that has changed many years ago, no? But I think that at a popular level, that image of Santa Anna remains very, very much alive and kicking to this day.
And how is Santa Anna depicted in popular culture?
There is in recent years, the last 30 years, there's been a couple of films and a novel by Enrique Serna. The novel by Enrique Serna, called El Seductor de la Patria, the seducer of the fatherland as such, appeared to be a novel that tried to see it from Santa Anna's perspective. And yeah, at the end, we see him without, no spoilers, but basically we end with him being the baddie as always. There is a song called Mala, where a line is as bad as Santa Anna's signature. So, yes, I mean, in terms of popular culture, he remains very much a baddie.
Do you think he deserves that reputation?
I think that it is not fair. I can understand where it's coming from. But in a way, I think that one has to, I would argue, one has to move away from this idea of heroes and villains, and one has to just understand these individuals within the historical context in which they moved, right? So somebody like Santana, also because Santana had such a long life, there's everything to it. So you have him, you can see on one level, he is this hero, this national hero. He fights against the Spaniards in 1829, or he fights against the French in 1838 and loses a leg fighting for Mexico. And in Texas, from a Mexican perspective, he's fighting to keep the country together. So in that sense, we can see a hero and a true patriot. At the same time, he is incredibly corrupt. And he is a horrific dictator from 1853 to 55. And actions such as the massacre in Goliad, for example, inevitably make us reconsider, what a great guy he was, right? I think that it's difficult to, in a way, when you have a figure that has been there for such a long time, to say whether they're good or bad. I mean, there's a bit of everything, really. But more importantly, I think we need to kind of consider the context that created Santa Anna and how, I mean, this is somebody who, when he was born, Mexico was part of the Spanish Empire with kind of an absolutist monarch, and where nobody had any electoral rights or there was no representative government. And by the time he dies, Mexico is an independent nation. It's half the size that it was, but it's kind of, you have a very radical 1857 constitution in place with universal male suffrage and a country that is a completely different universe to what he would have seen as a child.
You are now working with the Alamo on how Santa Anna is represented in the future Visitor Center and Museum. Tell us about that work.
I've been part of that endeavor, not so much, I think, just to kind of think in terms of how Santa Anna is depicted. I think it's more a case of trying to kind of look at it so that there is an awareness of a Mexican perspective. I think that is really kind of my remit, and that has been my input, really, is just kind of trying to bear in mind how this was seen, how the events in Texas were perceived at the time from a Mexican perspective.
What do you think the world gets wrong about Santa Anna?
I mean, I'm not sure whether the world is concerned with Santa Anna, but certainly from a Texan and a Mexican perspective, I think that on the one hand, from a Texan perspective, this view of him as this dictator at the time, which he wasn't, I think that would be one aspect. And from a Mexican perspective, just the ease with which kind of he's blamed for everything. A great Mexican historian who was my supervisor when I was in Mexico, Josefina Zoraida Vázquez, I mean, she famously said that from a Mexican perspective, had we not had Santa Anna, we would have had to invent him because he has kind of helped us explain so many things, right? So he served as this kind of scapegoat for everything that went wrong. And in that sense, at the time even, kind of Mexicans didn't have to kind of think why things had gone so wrong, and because it was just easy. You just blame Santa Anna.
Professor Will Fowler, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.
Be sure to check out the podcast notes. We've linked to Professor Fowler's biography, where you can learn more about his research, as well as check out the books he has written about this time period. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.